Hello students, welcome to Darasa Online. My name is Aaron Mwaituka. I am a commerce teacher. Our subject today is commerce. The topic is contract of sales, and the subtopic is concepts of contract of sales, whereby I will be exposing you to various concepts of contract of sales. And to remind you is that today is our second part of this revision in the same topic of contract of sales, where the first part I explained about contracts in general, and today in the second part of the revision I will explain about the concepts of contract of sales. So the topic is contract of sales. Subtopic is concepts of contract of sales. Now to start with, I will start with the definition. When we speak about contract of sales, just like any other contract, here is a situation where we speak about the two sides. Basically, we have two sides, that is the buyer and the seller, and those two sides must come together and they must agree on certain terms. Those terms, we call them terms of stipulation. Now, after agreeing, then they will start to execute the contract, whereby the seller will have to deliver the goods to the buyer, and the buyer will have to pay the price. So we say is an agreement where the seller transfers his right of ownership of goods in return for money consideration. In return for money consideration. So this is our definition. But remember, from my explanations, I said it is an agreement. So if it is an agreement, there are certain things which the two sides will agree upon. And those things, we call them terms of stipulation. Now let us see what are those terms of stipulation. Terms of stipulation. As I've said, these are the things which the two sides will agree upon. Now, the two sides will agree on the following. Number one, price. So when the two sides will meet together, they will agree or they will arrange the price. Number 2, time of delivery of goods. So this is on the side of the seller, will be responsible to deliver the goods at the agreed time. Then number 3, time and manner of payment of the agreed price. Time and manner of payment of the agreed price. This is whereby the buyer will be able to discuss with the seller on what terms the buyer will be using to make some payments. So they will agree on what terms the buyer will use. So the 4th one is called discount. Discount, if any. So this also is going to be an agreement where if it will depend on the amount of the goods which will be purchased by the buyer. And the last one here is about the one to incur freight, insurance, and handling charges. And handling charges. These are the expenses which will be incurred when executing the contract. So, as I've said, these are terms of stipulation. Now, if any of this is violated, it will amount to the cancellation of the contract. Now, after seeing these agreements and whatever they are going to agree, now here we may have a question of whatever we have explained so far. So this is the question. So the question can be, explain the elements of contract of sales. Explain the elements of contract of sales. So the main issue here is going to be elements. So elements of contract of sales. The first element is about mutual consent for the transaction. Mutual consent for the transaction. Now, as we have seen from the explanation of the concept of contract of sales, when we speak about consent, it is about agreement. Consent means agreement, and when we say mutual, it involves two sides. So what it means here means there must be an agreement between the buyer and the seller for the transaction. Another element, the subject matter should be goods. The subject matter should be goods. Now, in the element, as one of the elements of contract of sales, the main discussion is about goods. Now, what exactly it means when we are explaining about goods is that here we refer to movable property as well as stock and shares. So it refers to movable property as well as stock and shares. But also we have some concepts which are related to goods. These are as follows. We have the so-called existing goods and future goods. When we speak about existing goods, we refer to those goods which are under the possession of the seller. And when we speak about future goods, we refer to those goods which will be produced or manufactured. Another element is called transfer of goods. Transfer of goods. Now here, as we have seen from our definition, transfer of goods simply means transfer of ownership of goods. So here it could mean there is going to be transfer of ownership of goods from the seller to the buyer. Another element is about consideration. Now here, just to remind you, in the first part of our revision, I explained the meaning of a consideration, that a consideration is something which is given for exchange. Now, in our case here, as you can see, we have money consideration. So which means money should be the only thing which can be used as consideration. So consideration should be in form of money. And another thing about the elements of contract of sales is about the so-called sale or agreement to sell. So we have sell or agreement to sell. Now, when we speak about a sale in contract of sales, simply means ownership is transferred immediately. Ownership is transferred immediately. When we speak about agreement to sell, it simply means ownership will be transferred at a future date. So in a sale, ownership is transferred immediately. And in an agreement to sell, ownership is transferred at a future date. Transferred at a future date. Another element is that buyer and seller must be different persons. Buyer and seller must be different persons. What it means exactly is that the seller cannot sell goods and at the same time be a buyer to himself. So in other words, we can say a seller must sell goods to someone else other than himself or herself. So these are the elements of contract of sales. Now, after this explanation, let's move on to another thing. The other heading is about the subject matter of the contract of sales. The subject matter of the contract of sales. Here we have the following. Number one, methods of sales. Methods of sales. Here also we may have a question. So this can be a question. So we may have a question like this. Explain the methods of sales in the contract of sales. Explain the methods of sales in the contract of sales of goods. So here we can have the following methods. can have the following methods. The first one is called sale by inspection. Sale by inspection. Here it means the goods will be sent to the buyer, and the buyer will have an opportunity to actually see the goods or to inspect the goods and to see that they are in a good condition. So it is called sale by inspection. So the buyer will actually see the goods. So the buyer will actually see the goods. Then another method is called sale by description. Sale by description. This will happen if the two sides are at distant place. So here we can take an example or the case of foreign trade, where one or the seller is in another country and the buyer is also from another country. So in this way, some of the methods may be difficult to implement. So what they will do here is just the seller will send the goods to the buyer, but the goods will be such a way that they will have some descriptions which will help the buyer to go about with the goods. And they will contain various information which will simplify the understanding or will help to give knowledge to the buyer. And in the description, it will contain, or the description can be in the form of pictures or in the form of words. So here, if the two are at distant place, so the description can be in the form of words or pictures. Can be in the form of words or pictures. Another method is called sale by sample. Sale by sample. In this case, the sample will be sent to the buyer, and the buyer will be required to satisfy himself and to be convinced that he or she is comfortable with the goods. And after he or she is satisfied, that is when he will agree the offer and he will proceed to make an order. And the goods which will come must match with the sample which was shown before. And another method is called sale on approval or return. Sale on approval or return basis. Here there are two options. One is that when the buyer, or we can say the buyer must approve. And the only way the buyer will approve is that when the goods are sent to him, if he keeps them with him or her, then it is the sign to the seller that the buyer has agreed or has approved. That is one option. The second option is return. So if it happens that the goods were sent to the buyer and they have got certain defects, then the buyer in this case will have to return the goods. So this was the first subject matter of contract of sales. The other one is called condition and warranty. Condition and warranty. Now, to remind you is that here at the beginning we explained about the terms of stipulation, where we said those are the things which the two sides must agree upon. Now, those terms of stipulation can be written as condition or as warrant. And again here we can have a question. So we can have a question here. Distinguish between a condition and a warranty in the contract of sales. So here we have the following are the differences. So a condition, and on this side a warrant. So where I said a condition is a stipulation which is essential in the contract. That means something which is very important. But a warrant in a contract of sales, it refers to a stipulation which is a collateral, or we can say it is a subsidiary to the main stipulation. So here we can say a condition is a stipulation which is essential in a contract. But on the other side, a warrant is a stipulation which is collateral in a contract. Collateral in a contract. And another thing is that a condition goes to the root of a contract. So it goes to the root of the contract. But here, a warranty, it does not go to the root of the contract. A warranty does not go to the root of the contract. Another thing is about breach. Breach, as we explained in the first part of our revision about contracts in general, a breach, we said, is where someone violates those terms of stipulation. Now, in this case, if someone violates the term of stipulation, which is very essential in a contract, it may lead to cancellation or discharge of a contract. So breach may lead to discharge of a contract. So it means here breach may lead to discharge. So which means it may cause the contract to come to an end. Here, for breach, the buyer will seek for remedy. The buyer will seek for remedy. So which means here the buyer will not terminate the contract, but will look some ways in order to recover in the contract. So these are the differences between a condition and a warrant. Remember, we are going through the subject matter of the contract of sales. Another thing about the subject matter of contract of sales is about the rights of the seller. The rights of the seller in the contract of sales. Now, in the contract of sales, the seller has the following rights. Number one, to require the buyer to pay the price. The buyer to pay the price. Then another right, to require the buyer to take delivery of the goods. So these are, here we have the two main things, price and delivery. But sometimes the seller also may be required to deliver the goods in case the buyer applied for it. So the other one can be to deliver the goods. So this is the third thing about the subject matter of contract of sales. The fourth is about the rights of unpaid seller. The rights of unpaid seller. Now, the question can be, who is unpaid seller? Who is unpaid seller? Unpaid seller is a seller who has not received payment from the buyer. Now, the rights, we can divide them into two parts. The first part will be about rights against the goods. So if the seller is not paid, what will be his rights against the goods? So here, one is right of lien, the right of lien. By lien, we mean that the seller, if the goods are under his possession, he will not release the goods until he is paid. So this is what it means by right of lien. The seller will not release the goods until he is paid. Another thing is right to stoppage in transit. Right to stoppage in transit. In this case, if the goods are already being transported or they are on the way to the buyer, and the seller discovers that the buyer is bankrupt, he may order that the goods should be returned to the seller. Then another right is right to resell. So in this situation, the seller can have the right to resell the goods to other buyer. But here it can be when he discovers that the goods are perishable and the current buyer is not able to pay. But here the condition will be that he must notify the buyer that he is going to resell to someone else. So this is the first part about rights of unpaid seller. Now the second part is about rights against the buyer personally. Rights against the buyer personally. Now here he will have the following rights. Number one, sue for the price. Sue for the price. Now here to sue, it means the seller will rely on legal actions, or he will take some legal actions to sue the buyer. For the buyer will not be able to pay. Another thing is to sue for damages. In this case, as we have seen that the buyer maybe the buyer has refused to accept the goods. So what the seller again will do is to sue for the damages, because the seller shall have incurred some expenses to deliver the goods, but on the other hand, the buyer has refused to accept the goods. Then another is to sue for the interest. Sue for the interest. In this case, the seller will charge some reasonable rates to the buyer. Some reasonable rates to the buyer as interest. Now, the interest will cover from the time when payment was due until when the seller will receive the payment. Then another subject matter is about so number 5, the rights of the buyer. Now, in the contract of sales, the buyer has the following rights. Number 1, to examine the goods. Here it means the buyer has got the right to inspect the goods if they are in a good condition. Number 2, to reject the goods. So to reject the goods. Here the buyer also has got the right to reject the goods if the goods have got some defects. Again, another right is to sue for damages. To sue for damages. Suppose here the seller has refused to deliver the goods. So the buyer has got the right, as we have said before, to take legal actions against the seller. And finally here on this part, for breach of warranty. For breach of warranty, as we have seen before, breach of warranty here, a warranty is a stipulation which is just a collateral. It is a subsidiary where we said if it is in that way, the buyer will not terminate the contract, but he will just sue for the damage, or he will just look for the remedy. So here the buyer will have to sue for the damages and not to terminate the contract. Now another thing we have to explain is about delivery of goods. Delivery of goods. This is another concept which we have to explain. When we say delivery of goods, it simply means transfer of possession from one person to another. Now, in our case here, because the main parties are the seller and the buyer, it simply means transfer of possession from the seller to the buyer. So it simply means transfer of possession from one person to another person. And let's see what are the rules regarding delivery of goods. Rules regarding delivery of goods. Here we have the following. Number 1, we have place of delivery. Place of delivery. The place where the goods will be delivered must be mentioned in the contract that the goods will be delivered at a certain place. Now, in case the place to be delivered the goods was not mentioned in the contract, we have the following options. So there are two options. In a sale, we say that here, in case the place was not mentioned, if the contract was about the sale, remember, in the sale is where the goods are delivered immediately. Here, delivery will be made at the place where goods are to be sold. But in an agreement to sell, agreement to sell, here the place or the goods will be delivered at the place where the two sides, that is the buyer and the seller, met when they were making an agreement to enter into the contract. Another rule is with regards to time of delivery. Here, the time must be a reasonable time or a fixed time if it was mentioned into the contract. Another rule is about expenses of delivery. So, expenses of making the goods in a deliverable state must be met by the seller. So, unless otherwise stated, all the expenses of making the goods into a deliverable state must be met by the seller. So when we say deliverable state is to make the goods to be in a condition of being sold. And the last thing about rules regarding delivery of goods is when goods are under the possession of the third party. When goods are under the possession of the third party. So it means here a third party is someone who is outside the contract. So for one reason or the other, the goods can be in the hands of the third party. Now in this case, delivery cannot be made by the seller, but what is required is that this third party must acknowledge that he or she is possessing the goods on behalf of the seller. So this is with regards to delivery of the goods when goods are under the possession of the third party. Now, finally, let's see this question as a revision question. A seller entered into an agreement with the buyer to sell goods on credit. They agreed that delivery was to be made at a future date. When the seller was in the process of delivering the goods, the buyer notified him that he was not going to pay the price, to pay the price. As a commerce student, explained to him the rights of the seller in this case. So this is the revision question. So we have come to the end of this revision. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much